Alright guys, back to Maoism and Marxism, part 2. We've explored Mao's thought and character and tried to match it up to Marxism along the way. Mao's action is best seen through his development of Maoism, and this is best seen as antithetical to Marxism. Even though one can trace a continual development of Mao's thought as being his own distinct form throughout his rise of power, his thought as Maoism is clear once he attains victory in 1949. After the Yan'an era, which is 1935 to 1945, the best formulation of Maoism that I have discovered is the following, taken from the Miser entry on Mao in the Oxford Companion to Politics in the World. Quote, during the Yan'an era, the distinctive Chinese variant of Marxism-Leninism, canonized as Mao Zedong thought, crystallized as a formal body of doctrine. It was an ideology marked by powerful nationalist, populist, and voluntaristic impulses that greatly modified the inherited corpus of Marxist-Leninist thought. Indeed, Maoism implicitly defined itself in large measure by its departures from the main premises of Marxist theory. So notice, Maoism is a departure from Marxist theory. It was a doctrine that rejected the Marxist orthodoxy that capitalism is a necessary and progressive phase in historical development and thus the essential prerequisite for socialism. So it rejected the progression up the chain of development, if you will. In other words, what we would expect to see Marxism moving toward Europe and toward America, as opposed to, if you will, moving backwards or down developmentally toward Asia and toward what we see today, really toward Latin America and other countries. Accordingly, Maoism rejected the Marxist faith in the industrial proletariat as the necessary bearer of the new society, instead looking to the peasantry as the truly creative revolutionary class in the modern world. Further, Maoism inverted the Marxist concept of the relationship of the town and countryside in the making of modern history, rejecting the Marxist and Leninist assumption that the city is the source and site of socio-historical progress, and reflecting the lack of any real Marxist faith in objective laws of historical development, Maoism placed a decisive emphasis on the role of human will and consciousness in molding social reality. So the town and countryside take a more important role in Maoism than the city does in Marxism. Here, Meisner is overtly arguing that Maoism, the thought of Mao, is definitely a departure from Marx and Lenin. Meisner even argues that one can see an anti-Leninist approach in Mao's publications all the way back in 1927. Needless to say, Mao clearly establishes his own thought and his own brand of communism. As Meisner indicates above, here there are no universal laws of historical development for Mao. This is really kind of the crux. If you took away anything from my other videos on communism and Marxism, it's really the predetermined development of thought in history that brings on the proletariat revolution, one that we saw in Russia with the Bolshevik coup. This was not an inevitable, predetermined, right? This is, even though Marxist thought argues for the development and inevitable conclusion toward the socialist and communist state, we did not see that with Lenin, and we are definitely not seeing that with Mao. Mao is taking whatever route he can. Since he could not get a foothold in the cities and towns, he moved to the country. He then uses all resources he can from the peasantry to accomplish his aims. Maoism is a nationalist and populist movement that rejects capitalism as a necessary stage for the onset of socialism. In fact, Meisner goes on to argue that Maoism reveals a theme of permanent revolution that seeks to make society through all the necessary historic stages to attain socialism. Mao repeatedly attempted to make society move toward his goals through his ideas in Maoism. Maoism is also seen in some of his intentional campaigns that he led China through from the 1950s to the 1970s. The emphasis on populist involvement comes to the forefront in three noteworthy campaigns: the 100 Flowers campaign, the Great Leap Forward campaign, and the Cultural Revolution. Now, 100 Flowers campaign is 56 to 57, Great Leap Forward is 58 to 60, and Cultural Revolution is a full decade, 66 to 76. Though bearing Maoist thought and keeping the betterment of the nation in mind, each of these campaigns also, incidentally, serves to reveal rivals of Mao and stir up the country in favor of Mao. Notably, however, millions of people were killed directly or indirectly, sometimes through famine or poor economic planning and choice. Sometimes China did, in fact, have enough food for everyone, but Mao chose to export it to pay Russia for military equipment or to simply do his own military experimentation. Specifically, the Great Leap Forward killed close to, check it out, 38 million people. That's, by the way, more than Stalin killed in Russia and way more than Lenin killed. And this was the greatest famine in the 20th century it's the greatest famine in all of human recorded history. Mao knowingly starved and worked these tens of millions of people to death. It was during this time that people sometimes ate their own children, being so crazed with hunger. Mao is noted to have said during this time, quote, "Death is indeed to be rejoiced over. We believe in dialectics, and so we can't not be in favor of death. If people don't die, the earth won't be able to hold them. People live and people die. Who doesn't die?" Altogether, the three campaigns, being only a few among many, reveal quite clearly the kind of butcher Mao was and the places that Maoist thought took the nation. Furthermore, fortunately, Mao's reign and the decades of chaos, quote, the Cultural Revolution, came to an end after Mao's health deteriorated and he died. A month later, the Gang of Four was arrested and deposed. The regime quickly changed under the rule of Deng Xiaoping. Overall, Mao and Maoism are seen to be antithetical to Marxism-Leninism. This is not only seen in Mao's thought and private life or character, but in the manner in which he runs the country through his principles of Maoism. Progressively throughout his career, he reveals his individual plans for change. These plans tend to center on himself and propagating his own thought and power, not that of Marx or Lenin. They do not even center on the other prominent Russian leaders, as we will see next. Mao and Moscow. The last place to look to determine whether or not Mao is a Marxist is to look at his relationships with Soviet leaders. The first notable relationship is with Lenin. When Mao became a Marxist in 1920, Lenin was in power in Moscow. Already, Moscow was seeking to begin subversive tactics in China, and Mao got in on the party. All throughout the development of the CCP, Moscow and Lenin made choices that directly affected him, often supporting him when the CCP would not. As far as I can tell, Mao never met Lenin, but Lenin and Marx certainly had their portrait in the new Red State that was established in 1931. Obviously, Lenin was long past by this point, and the competitive relationship with Stalin had begun. The relationship between Mao and Stalin is one of rivalry, but Mao always recognized Stalin as a master. It was only until the CCP won the Civil War and took over China that Mao knew Stalin no longer controlled him. In the chapter titled Rivalry with Stalin, Cheng and Halliday state, Stalin remained totally committed to backing Mao, but he now took steps to contain him and to remind him who was master. Now, once again, I'm quoting from Mao, the Unknown Story here with Cheng and Halliday. Mao was recently making himself and his Chinese exploits look very good by getting international authors to write books about him and how he was specifically changing Marxism to an Asiatic form. Moscow was not publishing the books or articles by Edgar Snow and Anna Louise Strong. Those are some of the authors that were writing about Mao. This stonewalling by Stalin eventually made Mao trim some of his self-promotion in Chinese publications. Only then did Stalin begin to show favor again. Stalin recognized him as, quote, an insubordinate but successful ruler. However, as soon as Mao won China, Mao knew Stalin could not afford to disown him. Mao fully intended to force Stalin to help him advance his own global ambitions. Mao did do this, and together they pursued the Korean War, met up for Stalin's birthday, and pursued other military enterprises. It was through his relationship with Stalin that Mao learned how to carry on duplicitous relationships with heads of state, acting as their friend but secretly seeking to overthrow them. Mao had such a relationship with Stalin that when Khrushchev came to power, Mao was seen as a Stalinist. When Khrushchev came to power, Mao was interested in working with him. Of course, Mao was already quite independent, with Stalin and Russia ruling a quarter of the world's population. Thus, quote, Khrushchev came determined to establish the best possible relations. He wiped much of Stalin's slate clean, offering to scrap the secret annexes in the 1950 treaty, which infringed upon China's interests. He also agreed to supply more equipment for the 141 arms factories already underway, and to sell another 15 enterprises, and extend a new loan of 520 million rupees. Mao wanted more. Mao wanted an atomic bomb. At first, Mao admired Khrushchev for denouncing Stalin, but over time, Mao sought to undermine him as well. According to Cheng and Halliday, Mao was aiming to cut Khrushchev down to size as a leader of the communist bloc and make his own bid for the leadership, which had been his dream since Stalin's death. While managing the Taiwan Strait crisis to his own advantage, Mao was able to get everything he needed from Moscow and Khrushchev. Khrushchev no longer had any authority in Peking, and Mao no longer felt constrained by him. This was 1957, the year the 100 Flowers campaign began. By 1960, Mao was actively trying to split the communist parties and set up Maoist parties all over the world. In 1963, Mao gave the order to denounce Khrushchev by name as a revisionist. In the eyes of the modern revisionist, to survive is everything. The philosophy of survival has replaced Marxism, Leninism. Mao had sealed the door shut on relations with Khrushchev in favor of his own Maoism. When Brezhnev succeeded Khrushchev in 1964, Mao was interested to see if there was any relationship to be had. Unfortunately, Moscow underestimated Mao's desire for de-Stalinization in Moscow, and Moscow quickly saw that Mao stood in the way of their plans. At a meeting with some of Mao's top men, Russia's defense minister Malinowski denounced Mao, saying, quote, we've got rid of our fool Khrushchev, now you get rid of yours, Mao. Unfortunately for Russia, and thanks to the Malinowski episode, Mao had absolutely no relationship with Brezhnev. China's relations with the with the Soviet Union deteriorated to their worst ever under Brezhnev, who remained in power for the rest of Mao's life. Obviously, by now, Mao was getting old and suffering insecurity of power through the Cultural Revolution and other failed international moves. The relationship with Moscow would never recover, nor does Mao seem to desire it to recover. He had parted ways with Marxism, Leninism. With his death coming in 2 years, Maoism had gone global, and Mao had lived his prolific life. Now it was time to die and let his legacy take over. Now our final section to explore is Mao's legacy. Mao's legacy is best seen in the aftermath of his death and through the eyes of the CCP. Though Mao's death on September 9, 1976, though this death brought some change to the China state, his legacy is continually honored and affirmed. William Joseph in Politics in China, quoting the CCP's resolution on the certain questions in the history of our party since the founding of the People's Republic of China, quotes, Conrad Mao Zedong was a great proletarian revolutionary who made gross mistakes during the Cultural Revolution, but on the whole, his contribution far outweighs his mistakes. Even the CCP acknowledges some mistakes, but on the whole, Mao is great. Perhaps these gross mistakes could be compared to the story Jean-Louis Margolin relates in the Black Book of Communism in the chapter titled China, A Long March into the Night. And speaking of which, where did my Black Book of Communism go? Here it is. This is worth its weight in gold. This is the gold standard for all things terror, crimes, and repression for communism, or you could go to victimsofcommunism.org and see current day crimes, terror, and repression of communist states around the world. Back to it. Margolin relates how prisoner Jean Pasqualini received a swift kick in the ass from his Chinese gulag warder when Pasqualini decided to pee against the wall of the building instead of walking 200 yards in the cold to the latrine. This act obviously broke the sanitation rules, but as Pasqualini directly spoke to the warder had broken the law by inflicting violence upon the prisoner. The warder, much to Pasqualini's surprise, since he expected punishment for speaking back to the warder, said that he was right. The warder then said, I admit that I have made a mistake, and I will bring up this subject at our next warder's self-criticism meeting. Would you be ready to return to your cell and write me a thorough confession? Even if Mao's gross mistakes were actually seen as mistakes, as the warder is seen to have made a mistake, the mistakes of killing over 70 million people have not been rectified and were not rectified during his lifetime. If only the deaths of 70 million people could have received as much confession, self-criticism, and punishment as the minuscule, quote, swift kick in the ass. Mao never took the blame for the deaths of 70 million Chinese people who perished under his reign. Compare that to 20 million Soviets who died under Lenin and Stalin. Or even smaller numbers for Hitler. Mao outclasses every single one of them. He is literally a world-class killer. Cheng and Halliday write, Mao Zedong, who for decades held absolute power over the lives of 1/4 of the world's population, was responsible for well over 70 million deaths in peacetime, more than any other 20th century leader. By comparison to the other great killers, Lenin and Stalin, Mao outclasses them both. Nonetheless, the CCP still officially honors Mao before the whole world. Mao made mistakes, but these mistakes do nothing to affect his legacy. His legacy stands not as one of Marxism-Leninism, but of Maoism. Mao Zedong is not and was not a true Marxist. Conclusion. Mao Zedong reveals himself initially as a Marxist, but very quickly moves to promote himself as a Maoist communist. His thought is one of revisionism, seeking to develop Marxist-Leninist thought for Asian countries. There is a significant difference between Marxism and Maoism. His own approach to ruling China and the rest of the world is one of selfishness and self-promotion. His publication of the Little Red Book is a central attempt to promote his own thought instead of Marxism-Leninism. His own lifestyle and character reveals that he is not a consistent Marxist, as he lives the life of the bourgeois. His relationships with Soviet leaders over the years also reveals that his is primarily antithetical to Marxism-Leninism, seeking to gain his own way and oust Russian leadership. Even today, Mao's portrait and his corpse still dominate Tiananmen Square in the heart of the Chinese capital. The current communist regime declares itself to be Mao's heir and fiercely perpetuates the myth of Mao. These characteristics are not the true characteristics of Marxism-Leninism. All of this reveals the true nature of Mao Zedong and his brand of Chinese communism called Maoism. That concludes our two-part series on Mao and Marxism, exploring the overall question of whether Mao Zedong and his thought actually match up to Marxism, which is where it comes from. The ideology of Marx and Lenin come to fruition through the Soviet experiment in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. And what we see very quickly, within even a decade, you have the propagation and the spread of some of what they're trying to spread the idea to China, but over time, Mao just simply does his own thing. And in fact, when you look at the ideology of Marxism or scientific socialism, you'll see that Maoism is really almost the inverse of that ideology. So that leads us to the conclusion that Maoism is significantly different from Marxism. Thank you for joining.